These are the times that try men's souls. Extraordinary times when the fate of millions of people and a country are at stake. Only a few months ago, Scotland voted decisively to keep the United Kingdom together, and many of us believed that, for the time being, our work was done. Surely there was a possibility that we may have to go through this again, but most were ready to move on with their normal, non-political lives. It was hoped that there would be a period of calm and cooling off, which would allow Scotland and the entire United Kingdom to heal from the divisive referendum campaign. But within days, no, just hours of the result, it became clear that there would be no healing, no calm, and no cooling off. The passions and energies of the referendum have been carried over into the general election, where the SNP is looking to increase its presence in the House of Commons and masquerade as Scotland's national party. Worse, the ex-First Minister Alex Salmond, who lost the referendum, is attempting to be among this SNP wave that is also pretending that it will be a positive and constructive force for the UK. But make no mistake, so long as the SNP's constitution contains separation from the UK as its principal aim, the SNP is not likely to work in the interests of the UK as a whole, including Scotland. This is a party that does not believe in a country called Britain and already has one foot out of the door. First Minister Nicola Sturgeon is not putting independence to the side for anything. How can this party possibly work in the interests of Britain, including Scotland? Of course, they'll say that they care about the people of the rest of the UK and don't want to end the social union. But this is lip service because the social union is underpinned by the political and economic union, which altogether brings the people of Britain together into common bonds. And it was these common bonds forged over 300 years for which pro-union campaigners fought in the referendum last year. Now they find themselves fighting once again as the SNP campaigns on a platform of further cutting Scotland's ties with the rest of Britain. The Smith Agreement, which all parties signed, and the subsequent legislation is already proposing to loosen those bonds beyond what is comfortable for many people, such as the potential loss of a common law enforcement authority, the British Transport Police, as its Scottish operations may be taken over by the SNP's Police Scotland. Despite this, the SNP, which again signed the Smith Agreement, turned right around and dropped buckets of cold water on it to say that it wasn't enough and that they wanted more. Scotland is on course to have one of the most powerful devolved legislatures in the world, with powers that will rival those of a US, Australian, or German state, or a Canadian province. And yet the SNP will say that this is not enough. Of course, we should not be surprised, as they are the party committed to separation and nothing will satisfy them until they have picked apart the United Kingdom, either gradually or in one fell swoop. To this end, they claim to want full fiscal autonomy and devolve max for Scotland, which will effectively cut the shared links, financial, legislative, and otherwise, that make the UK work as a whole and end the sense of being part of the same country, which is what the SNP wants. But then again, we have also seen the SNP claim that they don't want full fiscal autonomy, but instead want full fiscal responsibility, and that they want it gradually over a period of years, probably towards the end of the next parliament. This is coming from the same people who claimed that Scotland could be fully independent within 2 years following a yes vote. But with the collapse of oil prices since then, the economic case for devolve max, let alone independence, which was flimsy to begin with, has faltered. Perhaps for this reason, Alex Salmond and others are pushing the idea that the UK will cover the costs of full fiscal autonomy in Scotland and that everything will be just fine, with the Barnett formula and the block grant virtually unchanged. But for heaven's sake, this is an implicit admission that FFA will not work in Scotland's best interests, and that Scotland benefits from being part of the UK and the UK-wide tax and spending system. Yes, it is true that Scottish tax revenue to the UK Treasury, oil included, was £400 higher per head than the UK average in the previous fiscal year of 2013-2014. But, according to the Scottish Government's own figures, Scotland also received £1,200 more per head in public spending, which represents a whopping rate of return of 200%. Astonishing, isn't it? Indeed, all parts of the UK benefit from being together in an interwoven system of pooling and sharing that in many ways are not entirely obvious, but will become very obvious if the UK were to break up or becomes loosened to the point where those benefits no longer exist and the loss will be felt by everyone. Nevertheless, the SNP currently rides high in the polls, and they are casting themselves as Scotland's national party, the only party that truly represents and cares about Scotland, which implicitly means that the other parties, Labour, Conservative, and the Liberal Democrats, as well as their supporters, aren't truly Scottish, cannot possibly represent Scotland, or don't care about Scotland. This dangerously leads to the proposition that such people are against Scotland. For if the SNP is for Scotland having a voice in the British Parliament, what do we make of the other parties that believe Scotland's best interests are within Britain and who wish to keep Britain together? Scotland has always had a voice in the UK Parliament through the MPs that have been elected to represent its various constituencies, which have rarely, if ever, constituted a single voice that represents all of Scotland. The only difference today is whether SNP MPs who have no interest at all in maintaining the UK will be elected in mass numbers. The SNP claims that the other parties look over their shoulders to Westminster, but what this really means is that they have to work with other MPs across the UK in order to get things done. On this point, it must be said that the SNP is not Scotland and that Scotland is not the SNP. The SNP is just another political party that wants the votes of people in order to obtain political power, nothing more or less. Further, the SNP is the party of separation, first, second, and last, and the last time I checked, Scotland voted against this, and some polls still show this to be the majority opinion, despite the rise of the SNP. Therefore, a vote against the SNP is not a vote against Scotland. To talk down the SNP and criticize its policies is not the same thing as talking down and criticizing Scotland. To be pro-union is not to be anti-Scottish. Over the last few months, I have become greatly despaired at how some Scots who voted to maintain the Union now feel as though they have no place in their own country. This includes native-born Scots who grew up in Scotland, went to school in Scotland, decided to get married and raise their families in Scotland, work and live in Scotland, and in some cases have decided to retire in Scotland. People who saw no contradiction in being proud Scots and patriotic Brits, and now feel unnerved by the upheaval that appears to be going on around them. This also includes Scots born in the rest of the UK, who in some cases have been told to go back to England. It therefore further pains me to see some such people, as well as native-born Scots, taking the hint and making plans to leave Scotland as soon as possible because they have had it with what's been going on in the last 4 years since the SNP won its majority at the Scottish Parliament, with the referendum and the peddling of grievances and stoking of division within Scotland and throughout the United Kingdom. Of course, you will never hear the SNP leadership say the things their fervent supporters say on Twitter and Facebook and other platforms, And of course, it is entirely possible that such things are not representative across Scotland beyond the cybernets, on the internet, and the more vocal and visible activists on the ground. But nevertheless, there are people who now feel uncomfortable with the rhetoric, the loss of rational thought, and in some cases how they have been treated in their personal lives, and that is simply sad. Is this supposed to be the warm and fuzzy civic nationalism that we've been hearing about for the last couple of years? It is therefore necessary that in order to stop the SNP, people are going to have to engage in tactical voting at this election. On this point, I have been heartened to see various groups promoting tactical voting at a grassroots level to keep the SNP out of seats where it is possible for a pro-union majority to see off the party and their separatist goals. Of particular interest is the Gordon constituency, where the Liberal Democrats' Christine Jardine appears to be the best candidate to defeat the former First Minister. Here and in other places, people who support the Union should rally around the candidate who can defeat the SNP in their constituency. For this, I recommend looking into campaigns such as United Against Separation, Scotland's Big Voice, Scotland in Union, and Forward Together in Perth, who are making a determined effort to unseat Pete Wishart, as well as to keep the constituency next to his in the Labour column. Again, it will be difficult for some to vote for a party for whom they've never voted, and this is understandable. But the future of Scotland and its place in the UK is on the line, and so tough choices are going to have to be made. The SNP must be halted and cannot be allowed to call referendum after referendum after referendum until they get the result that they want, and along the way continue to divide Scotland and rip the UK apart. They are not deities and they are not infallible. They must be criticized and scrutinized. We should not get to the point when the SNP escapes legitimate criticism because it has declared itself as Scotland's national party. After all, who wants to criticize the National Party, the party that cleaves itself into the fabric of Scottish society and identity to the point where criticism of it is taken to be illegitimate and outrageous criticism of and talking down to the Scottish people, even if that criticism comes from Scots themselves? Together, pro-union supporters, whatever their affiliation, won't be able to stop the SNP everywhere, but they can prevent them from obtaining the eye-watering number of seats they are projected to get. And one less seat for the SNP is one more good thing for Scotland and the United Kingdom as a whole. No one should argue against the legitimacy of duly elected SNP MPs in the House of Commons, and there is a tiny part of me that hopes that they can make a positive and constructive contribution to British governance. However, it is difficult to believe that the SNP, with a larger presence in the Commons, would be a positive and constructive force for the United Kingdom as a whole. They cannot be trusted so long as their main aim, their raison d'etre, remains separation and breaking up Britain. For everyone's sake, I hope that I'm wrong, but their long-term interest has always been separation. Even if you don't have an emotional attachment to the Union, but otherwise have reservations about the SNP and its policies, you should at least be concerned with the economic, political, and constitutional implications of an SNP victory, which is why it is imperative to defeat them at the ballot box. As I continue to write my book on the 3 years of the referendum, I have not lost faith in the ability of pro-union supporters to overcome differences and to come together. But bickering and falling out with each other will be our downfall, and therefore the downfall of the British experiment of union known as the United Kingdom, which has similarities to and predates the American experiment of union known as the United States. I realize that the situation appears bleak, that it seems as though the die has been cast. Some of you wonder if the politicians actually care about the Union or are more interested in winning an election and obtaining political power. On this point, it would be better for the main parties to focus on the SNP and its record, which is not all that glorious, rather than turning on each other and hoping for general election gain at the long-term expense of the Union. However, in many ways, it's not about the politicians. Instead, the outcome of the election may very well come down to you, the rank-and-file supporter of the Union, the people who believe that there is more that unites than divides the people of Britain, to make a special effort to save it as you did last year. Now is not the time to go wobbly. Now is the time to stand up and make a difference to keep the SNP in check. Yes, you can do it. I believe that you can. The stakes have never been higher for a general election, and it is time to stand together and put aside party loyalties for the good of the country. So come on, people, let's make it happen on May 7th, 2015.